The night my family decided to explain my life to a room full of strangers, I was sitting 4 chairs away from my brother and wearing a dress my mother had picked out because, as she put it, she wanted me to look like I was trying. That was the thing about my family. They were always very concerned with appearances. Not mine, specifically. Mine was more of a problem to be managed. But theirs? That was a full-time operation. Before I tell you what happened that night, go ahead and like this video. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from, and share this if you've ever had someone speak over your entire life, like you weren't even in the room. Because what happened at that dinner, I never saw it coming, and I don't think my family did either. My name is Maya Collier. I grew up in a family where success had a very specific shape. It had to be visible. It had to be something you could say out loud at a dinner table and watch people's expressions shift toward impressed. My father built his career in commercial real estate. Deals, handshakes, his name on signs outside buildings. My brother followed a version of the same path, moving into corporate finance in his late 20s, the kind of job that came with a business card heavy enough to feel like something. My mother collected their achievements the way other people collect art. She displayed them constantly, rearranging the narrative depending on who was in the room. And then there was me. I was the one who didn't quite fit the frame. Not because I had failed, though my family had largely settled on that interpretation, but because what I did didn't translate easily into dinner table conversation. There were no signs with my name on them. No business cards I could hand across a table. No company anyone would recognize from a highway billboard. What I did required confidentiality agreements and a tolerance for silence, and neither of those things made for a good story at a family gathering. So for most of my adult life, I simply let them tell whatever story they needed to tell. The dinner was my parents' 30th anniversary. My mother had chosen a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths ironed flat and servers who refilled your water glass before you noticed it was half empty. My father had invited a few close friends, my aunt and her husband, and my brother had asked if he could bring someone from work, a colleague he wanted my father to meet. My father said yes immediately, the way he always did when my brother asked for anything. I arrived on time. My mother greeted me at the door with a look that lasted a half-second too long, scanning, assessing, landing on something close to resigned. She straightened the collar of my dress before I could say hello. "You look fine," she said. Fine, the word she used when she meant the opposite of remarkable. The private dining room was warm, lit by pendant lights that cast everything in amber. Round table, 8 chairs, a floral centerpiece my mother had probably approved in advance. I found my seat and sat down quietly. My brother was already there, standing near the far end of the table, laughing with someone I hadn't met. The colleague, I assumed. Mid-40s, broad-shouldered, the kind of compose that comes from decades of negotiating rooms. He was listening more than he was talking, which I noticed. My brother caught my eye and gave me a small wave, the kind of wave you give someone you're glad is present but don't intend to include. I smiled back. It was fine. I knew how these evenings worked. The conversation started the way it always started. My father anchored the table, moving between stories about a new acquisition he was advising on and commentary about the state of the market. My brother added supporting detail at the right moments, the two of them operating like a practice team. My mother smiled and nodded and occasionally redirected the conversation back toward my father's anniversary toast, which she had clearly been rehearsing. My aunt asked about my cousin's new apartment. Her husband talked about a cruise they were planning. No one asked me anything. Not directly. At one point, early in the meal, my mother turned toward me with a soft expression and said to the table, "Maya is still figuring things out. She's always been the free spirit of the family." She laughed a little. The table laughed with her. My father nodded the way you nod when someone has said something obvious. I pressed my fingers flat against the tablecloth and focused on the texture. Free spirit. It was the phrase they used when they couldn't say lost without it sounding cruel. It was gentler than some of the things they'd said over the years, but it landed the same way. A label applied publicly, with warmth, in a way that made it impossible to argue without looking sensitive. I didn't argue. I had stopped arguing years ago. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned that defending yourself to people who have already decided what you are is an exercise in exhausting yourself for no return. So I nodded. I smiled. I picked up my water glass and took a sip. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever thought to ask about, was that my mornings started before most of them were awake, that I had been on a call with a legal team in London the previous Thursday at 5 in the morning, still in my kitchen with a coffee going cold beside my laptop, that I had spent the last 14 months working on a transaction that I was contractually forbidden from discussing with anyone outside of the deal team, that the silence my family interpreted as drift was, in fact, discipline. I had been doing M&A advisory work for 3 years, not at a firm with a name anyone would recognize. I worked independently, brought in by larger consultancies on sensitive mandates, the kind where the client's name couldn't appear on any communication until the deal closed. The work was quiet by design. You didn't build a reputation through visibility. You built it through outcomes, through referrals passed between people who didn't talk publicly about how they found you. My name existed in a very specific network of people who understood that confidentiality wasn't a preference, it was the product. My family had no idea. They had asked vaguely a few times. My mother once suggested I was doing something with computers, which she meant as a compliment. My brother had, about 18 months prior, offered to connect me with someone at his firm who was always looking for analysts, the implication being that I needed rescuing. I thanked him and said I was fine. He nodded in a way that meant he didn't believe me. I had let it go. It was easier. The night wore on. My father made his toast. My mother cried a little, beautifully, the way she did everything. The food arrived in courses and the wine went around twice. My brother told a story about a deal his firm had recently closed, something to do with a mid-market manufacturing company, and his colleague, the one who had come with him, listened attentively, adding a comment here and there that suggested he was more senior than my brother in ways my brother was trying not to make obvious. I watched the colleague more than I watched anyone else. He had an attentiveness I recognized, the kind that comes from spending years in rooms where the most important information is almost never the thing being said out loud. He wasn't performing, wasn't managing. He was just observing. And somewhere around the second course, he began observing me. It started small. A glance when my mother made the free spirit comment, a slight pause in his expression that he didn't quite smooth over fast enough. Then again when my father made a joke about how not everyone is built for the pressure of real work. He looked at me when he said it. Briefly, the way you look at someone when you're checking whether the joke landed on them the way you intended. My father's eyes went to me automatically. The table registered it. I looked at my plate. The colleague's expression didn't change, but his focus did. I could feel it. I kept my hands steady. I kept my breathing even. I had been in enough high-pressure rooms to know that the moment you let tension into your body, you give something away. So I stayed still, and I let the conversation move around me, and I waited for the evening to be over. It was during the main course that my brother started talking about the firm's upcoming advisory calendar. Things were busy, he said. Big mandates, interesting clients, a couple of transactions that would keep everyone working through the spring. He was glowing with it, the sense of being at the center of something that mattered. My father was leaning forward. My mother was smiling with something close to reverence. My brother gestured toward his colleague. Marcus has been heading up our cross-border practice for the last 2 years, he said, the kind of work that takes years to build credibility for. Marcus, that was the first time I'd heard his name, nodded briefly. More acknowledgement and pride. It's a niche space, he said. Takes time to find the right people. My mother turned to him with her warmest expression. And what kind of clients do you typically work with? Marcus answered with the practiced brevity of someone who had answered that question many times. Mid to large cap transactions, confidential mandates, cross-border structuring. He named the type of work without naming names. My mother nodded as if she understood every word. There was a pause in the table's rhythm. Then Marcus looked at me. Not a glance this time. An actual, considered look. What do you do, Maya? The table shifted almost imperceptibly. My brother reached for his wine. My father straightened slightly. My mother's hand moved toward the bread basket in the way she did when she was preparing to intercept. She's been exploring different things, my mother said gently, before I could draw a breath to speak. Maya's always been creative. She does a little bit of everything. Marcus looked at my mother for exactly 1 second. Then he looked back at me. "I was asking Maya," he said. Not unkindly, just precisely. The table went quiet in a way that was different from the ordinary quiet of a pause. My father looked at Marcus with an expression that couldn't decide between surprised and offended. My brother's jaw tightened by a degree. I felt the old reflex kick in, the pull toward deflecting, toward saying something vague that would let everyone return to the narrative they were comfortable with. I felt it, and I let it pass. "Advisory work," I said. "M&A, mostly." My brother gave a short laugh that he tried to make sound casual. "She means she's done some research projects for smaller clients." He picked up his fork. "It's early stage." Marcus did not pick up his fork. "What sector?" he asked. "It varies," I said. "I've been focused on healthcare infrastructure over the last year. Some cross-border work." Something shifted in Marcus's expression. It was small, barely a movement at all. But I had seen it before. The recalibration. The moment when someone realizes the frame they brought into a room needs adjusting. "Independent?" he asked. "Yes." "Deal size generally?" My mother laughed softly. "Marcus, she's being modest. She does a few small projects here and there." "Mom." My voice was quiet, not sharp, not defensive, just enough to stop her. She stopped. I don't think I had ever used that tone with her in front of people before. She blinked. I looked at Marcus. The mandate I closed most recently was 8 figures. I can't name the parties. The table did not make a sound. My brother had gone very still. My father's fork was resting against the edge of his plate, forgotten. My aunt looked at my uncle. My mother's expression had moved through several things in rapid succession and was now somewhere I didn't have a name for. Marcus leaned forward by a fraction and his voice dropped to something more private, though not private enough to not be heard. "I need to ask you something," he said slowly, "and I apologize if this is a strange question for a dinner table." He paused. "Did you work on the Meridian Health transaction? Closed around October last year?" The air in the room changed. I felt it before I processed it. A kind of density, like the pressure before a door opens. I looked at him steadily. "I'm not able to discuss specific mandates," I said. "You know that." Marcus sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We've been trying to find out who the independent advisor was on that deal for 6 months. Our firm had a competing mandate. We came in 3 weeks late and couldn't understand how the other side had been structured so well." He shook his head, and there was something in his expression that looked almost like admiration. It was elegant. Whoever did it had a very specific kind of cross-border knowledge that doesn't come from a textbook. My brother made a sound. Not a word. More of a start, a correction that didn't make it out. "That was you," Marcus said. It wasn't a question anymore. I didn't confirm it. I didn't have to. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set his business card on the table, placed it in front of me the way you place something you want to be taken seriously. "We've been trying to get a meeting with your contact for 2 months, he said. "The referral network doesn't give out names. I didn't realize I'd find you here." A pause. Of all places. The last 3 words landed softly. He didn't mean them the way they could have been meant. He wasn't mocking the setting, but they landed on my family the way they were going to land regardless of his intention. My father looked at the business card, then at me, then back at the card. My brother pushed his chair back an inch, a small, unconscious movement. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" he asked. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him before. Not quite anger, not quite embarrassment. Something in between that didn't have a comfortable place to land. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, set it back down. "You never asked," I said. 3 words. I had been carrying them for years without knowing that was the form they would eventually take. The table stayed quiet long enough to become uncomfortable. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at the tablecloth. My aunt cleared her throat. The server appeared briefly at the doorway and then withdrew, apparently sensing that now was not the time. My brother opened his mouth. I just meant, we thought. I know what you thought, I said. Still quiet, still even. It's okay. But it wasn't really directed at him anymore. It was just a thing I said so I could be done. Marcus was watching me with the expression of someone who had understood more of the subtext of the evening than he'd been invited to understand. He didn't say anything else about the deal, or the work, or the 6 months of trying to find a name that was, it turned out, sitting across a dinner table from him on a Thursday night in November. I stayed for the remainder of the meal, not because I owed anyone the performance of normalcy, but because leaving the moment the silence fell would have made it about drama. And it wasn't drama. It was just the truth, arriving late and without ceremony, the way truth usually does. My mother made one attempt to recover the evening. She turned to Marcus and began talking about my father's most recent project, filling the space with the familiar architecture of their success, rebuilding the walls of the narrative she was comfortable inside. Marcus listened politely. My father joined in, relieved, I think, to be back on familiar ground. My brother stayed quieter than usual. I ate my food. I watched the candle in the center of the table. I thought about the call I had scheduled for 7 the next morning, a preliminary conversation about a transaction that had been 3 months in the making. I thought about the quiet of my apartment, the hum of my laptop fan, the particular satisfaction of work that doesn't need an audience. When the meal ended, I helped carry the small gift bags my mother had prepared for the guests to the front of the restaurant. Marcus was putting on his coat near the door when I passed him. I meant what I said about the meeting, he said quietly. I know, I said. I'll be in touch. He nodded. There was a respect in it that had nothing to do with pity, and that distinction mattered to me more than I would have been able to explain. I said goodbye to my aunt, hugged my father, told my mother the dinner was beautiful. She held onto my arm for a moment when I started to pull away. Maya. Her voice had a quality it almost never had. Something stripped of the usual management. I didn't know. I looked at her. She wasn't asking forgiveness. I don't think she was quite there yet, but there was something genuine underneath the words, a loosening of some long-held certainty. I know you didn't, I said. That's okay. I meant it more than I expected to. Outside, the air was cold and clean, the kind of November cold that sharpens the edges of things. I walked to my car without hurrying. The city moved around me. Headlights, voices, a restaurant door opening somewhere down the block releasing warmth and noise into the dark. I sat in my car for a minute before starting it, not because I was emotional, though I felt something, just not the thing I would have predicted. Not triumph. Not vindication in the clean-cut way you imagine it when you're younger and angrier. Something quieter than that. Something that felt more like the releasing of a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. The thing about building something invisible is that you get very good at not needing anyone to see it. You learn to measure progress in ways that have nothing to do with other people's awareness. You learn to let silence do its work without helping it along. And somewhere in the middle of all that, you stop waiting for the moment when everything is revealed and everyone understands and the record is corrected. You stop needing that moment. So when it came, not dramatically, not on my terms, not in the shape I had once imagined, it felt less like victory and more like completion. A thing that had been unfinished finally, quietly, finishing. In the weeks after the dinner, I kept my routines the same. Early mornings, late calls, the careful, meticulous work of moving complicated pieces into alignment. Marcus and I connected professionally, the way two people connect when they have mutual respect and a shared language and nothing to prove to each other. We talked about structure and timing and the particular challenges of deals that cross multiple jurisdictions. It was one of the better conversations I'd had in months. My brother texted me once, about 2 weeks after the dinner. It wasn't an apology exactly, more of a reach, a tentative thing. He said he'd been thinking about that night and that he realized he'd made a lot of assumptions. He said he was proud of me, though the word looked like it cost him something to type. I read the message twice. Then I replied and said, thank you, that it meant something, because it did, even if it arrived late, even if it couldn't undo years of being looked at the way he had looked at me. My mother called on a Sunday, which she often did, but this time the call was different. She didn't fill it with updates and social calendar items. She asked me, plainly, what I was working on. Not, "Are you okay?" or "Are you sure things are going well?" but "What are you working on?" as though she had decided to stop pretending there might not be an answer. I told her a version of it, the shape without the specifics. She listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "I think I owe you an apology for some things." I told her we could talk about it another time, that there was no rush, that I wasn't going anywhere. That was the truest thing about all of it when I looked back. Not the moment at the dinner table, not the business card placed in front of me, not even Marcus's very careful 3 words of all places. The truest part was what I understood afterward, alone and quiet and driving home through a city that didn't know or care what had happened at a table inside it. I had never been lost. I had been building something. The difference between those two things is real, and it matters, and no one else's failure to see it was ever going to make it less true. The version of me that had needed them to understand finally stopped needing it. And that, more than anything that happened at that dinner, felt like freedom. If you've ever been in a room where the people who were supposed to know you best looked right through you, I want you to know something. Their blindness was never a measurement of your worth. It was a measurement of the limits of their attention. Those are not the same thing. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And if this story stayed with you, share it. Someone you know might need to hear it today. I'll see you in the next one.